Welcome to today's Employment Standards webinar, Rules for the Construction Industry. My name is Barry Mullaney and I'll be your facilitator for today's session. Today you will hear some of the same general information from our other webinars as our rules apply broadly across different topics. We will then focus on the construction industry and their employees, where Employment Standards has some specific rules that apply depending on the work that is being done. Let's get started. As always, please be aware of our disclaimer and copyright notice, and I'll give you a moment to read it. Basically, we've made every effort to give you the correct information, but if there are any discrepancies between this presentation and the Employment Standards Code, the code will prevail. And please note, the copyright on this presentation belongs to the Government of Alberta. The goals for today are to provide you with a general overview of Alberta's current employment standards relating to those in the construction industry, as well as highlight some additional resources to assist you in finding more detailed information. So, what are employment standards? The Employment Standards Code provides the minimum standards of employment. These rules apply to most folks working in Alberta with a few exceptions. This could include those who work in federally regulated industries such as banks or telecommunications, where these industries often have alternate legislation defining those workers' entitlements and protections. When covered under Alberta's employment standards, employers and employees cannot make agreements for less than the minimum standards. There are some unique rules for different industries found in the regulation, like the way overtime hours are determined for those in the trucking industry, or how general holidays are treated for construction workers, which we will be reviewing a little bit later. The Employment Standards Code also establishes the framework for program delivery and enforcement of the entitlements under the code. And while the code establishes minimum standards, an employer can always choose to offer greater benefits to the employee if they wish. Listed here are some, but not all the topics covered under the Employment Standards Code. We'll be going through many of these today, but if we've missed anything you think would be relevant to you, please head over to our website for. Here's what we'll be covering on today's session. First, we're going to look at whether a person is an employee or a contractor. Then we'll look at record-keeping requirements, wages and the payment of earnings, deductions, hours of work and rest periods, overtime, then special rules for construction, general holiday pay and vacation pay, as well as exemptions overlap, termination notice and termination pay, job protective leaves, and then we'll wrap up and provide you with a few more resources. So before we jump into the employment standards rules, we'd like to review situations when an employee may be considered a contractor or when a contractor may be considered an employee. As mentioned earlier, employment standards rules apply to most working Albertans, but only to those who are considered employees. If a person is considered a contractor or self-employed, the rules that we'll review today do not apply. Here are some general themes we look at within employment standards to determine whether a worker is an employee or a contractor. Direction and control. So we might ask who decides when and how the work is done. Ownership of facilities, supplies, tools, and equipment. So who owns what and who is responsible for it? As well as transfer of profit or risk of loss. So again, who stands to make a profit or suffer a loss because of the working relationship? And then we look at integration. Do the people performing a service consider themselves to be a business for themselves or for the business they're working for? This review process is also known as the fourfold test. As employment standards cannot accept complaints from individuals who are not employees, we may have to review the working relationship to determine if the worker is protected under the employment standards legislation. Here are some comparisons with employee relationships and contractor relationships that help determine the status of a worker. I'll give you a few moments to read this. As you can see, there is not a single piece of information that is relied on to decide whether someone is an employee or a contractor. All factors are considered and examined closely. When a worker is not determined to be an employee under employment standards, we direct them to speak to a lawyer to review their concerns. More information on whether a person is an employee or a contractor can be found in our Employment Standards Toolkit, which is in our Employment Standards website under Education and Resources. All right, now that we have reviewed information on differentiating between an employee and a contractor, let's review the rules for those who are considered employees. Firstly, we'll review an employer's requirement for record keeping. A job application, a letter of offer, or an email are probably the first types of records an employer will begin to keep when hiring a new employee. Proper record keeping is not only useful, but also mandated in the legislation. This slide summarizes fundamental documents that employers must keep for their employees. Some categories do not apply to individuals employed as managers, supervisors, professional employees, or outside salespeople, but all records must be kept for a minimum of 3 years. The keeping of complete and comprehensive records assists in resolving disputes between employers and employees. If a complaint is made, employers can support their position by providing records as evidence to an officer. If an employer does not keep records, an employment standards officer is permitted to make an assessment for outstanding earnings using any manner the officer considers appropriate. The employer is also required to provide a statement of earnings to employees at the end of each pay period. The statement should be in paper or electronic form and contain all the categories listed on this slide. Earnings should be shown as separate lines, and the information should be clear as to what is being paid. Providing this information to employees supports transparency in their pay, and this also allows for open communication should there be any discrepancies with pay or their records. Now we'll take a look at wages. Wages are to be paid for work that has been performed. Hourly wages, salaries, or commissions are all examples of wages. The definition of wages excludes many things. Other employment standards entitlements are not wages, and the excluded item on the slide should not form part of the calculation for wages, such as expenses, gifts, and tips are also not wages and are not covered under entitlements in the legislation. It is important to determine accurate wages as the other categories of entitlements rely on wages for their calculation. When wages are calculated in error, all the other earnings will be inaccurate as well. Currently, the minimum wage in Alberta is $15 per hour. There is also a student minimum wage, a weekly minimum wage, and a monthly minimum wage. Head over to our website to see if these alternate minimum wages. In general, if an employee is required to work and then there isn't enough work available, then they must be paid 3 hours at the minimum wage or paid their regular wages for the time they worked, whichever is greater. There are some exceptions to this, however, such as for school bus drivers who must be paid only 2 hours at minimum wage. Here are examples of calculating the 3-hour minimum. In this situation, two employees were called in for a shift, but something happened with the equipment and they only worked 2 hours. Ramesh has an hourly wage of $25 per hour. In looking at the compensation, we can see 2 hours at $25 per hour equals $50, whereas 3 hours at minimum wage is $45. Ramesh is therefore entitled to $50, which is their wage for the hours that they actually worked, because that amount is the greater of the two. Jamal, on the other hand, has a lower hourly wage of $18 per hour. His $18 per hour for the 2 hours worked equals $36. The entitlement of 3 hours at minimum wage is $45. Therefore, he must be paid the minimum pay of $45 because it is greater. If an employee limits their own availability and for this reason does not work for 3 hours or more, the employer is only required to pay the employee for the hours they worked. This is the only instance where an employer would be required to provide payment when an employee did not perform work. Our legislation does not otherwise impose minimum scheduled hours of work or payment for employees that do not work. For example, an employee is scheduled for 10 hours of work, but due to equipment failure, the employee only worked 6 hours. There is no requirement for the employer to top up payment to meet the original 10-hour shift scheduled, and no requirement for the days following if problems persist and work cannot be performed. Please also note that training must be paid if it occurs after employment starts. This includes situations where a new employee job shadows an existing employee. An employee performing such work is entitled to the payment of wages. The applicant bears the responsibility and cost of obtaining any necessary training or certifications mandated by the employer as a condition of hiring. Let's review the rules for travel time. Generally, the time spent commuting to and from the work site is not considered time spent working. Travel time is work when employees go from one job site to another, or if they must pick up materials or perform any tasks on the way to or from work. As an example, Dan wakes up in the morning and drives to the shop. This is his normal commute and is not considered work time. He then takes the company truck to pick up materials, goes to the job site, and drops the materials off. This is considered work time. Dan returns to the shop, and before leaving for the day, Dan is directed to take home the company truck so that he can pick up more materials the next morning to bring to the job site. At the end of the day, Dan leaves the shop to go home. This is his normal commute time and not considered work time. The next day, Dan wakes up and leaves home to go pick up the materials. This is considered work time as he was directed to perform duties on the way to work. Travel time may be paid out at a different rate if the employee is informed ahead of time and the rate is at least the minimum wage. And now we'll look at payment. Employers must pay their employees at least once a month or use one of the following pay periods as listed on the slide. Earnings must be paid within 10 days after the end of the pay period in which they were earned. Electronic statements of earnings are acceptable as long as employees have confidential access and can print a copy of the statement. When employment ends, employers may choose between two time frames in which final earnings are paid. Employees must receive their final pay within 10 consecutive days after the end of the pay period in which termination occurred, or within 31 consecutive days after the last day of employment. Employees may be paid in cash, check, or direct deposit. We'll now move on to deductions. Employers can deduct overpayments without an employee's written consent for the following: payroll calculation overpayments or errors that occurred within 6 months, and vacation pay paid in advance to it being earned. Employers must provide advance written notice to the employee that the deduction will occur. If an employer notices in their records that today there was an overpayment or error that happened 8 months ago beyond the 6 month limitation, the employer may make an adjustment only if they have the employee's written consent. It's important for employers and employees to be reviewing their records and pay statements often enough to catch any concerns before too much time. Listed here are some other permitted deductions. In general, employers may make these deductions as needed without the employee's consent. Usual deductions include federal or provincial income tax or other federal requirements. Additionally, judgments, court orders, or union fees can be deducted as well. Otherwise, an employer must obtain written authorization for other categories of deductions. For example, Social Committee funds or monthly cafeteria fees. Meals and lodging, if provided by the employer, may be deducted with authorization, but have maximum amounts which are listed on the slide here. Note that employers cannot deduct and employees cannot personally authorize deductions for the following: faulty workmanship, which included accidental damage to an employer's vehicle or equipment or mistakes in production; cash shortages if more than one person had access to the cash; loss or damaged equipment, as well as uniforms or special articles of clothing that the employee is required to wear during their work hours. Please note personal protective equipment, or PPE, is not considered a part of a worker's uniform under employment standards. For questions regarding PPE requirements, please contact Occupational Health and Safety at 1-866-415-8690. And now we'll look at hours of work and rest periods. The code also requires that hours of work do not exceed 12 hours in any one day unless an accident occurs, urgent work is necessary, or other unforeseeable or unpreventable circumstances occur. Some industries, like road building or heavy construction, have an exemption to the 12-hour rule, which we will discuss in a few slides. Please note that this rule is also called hours of work confined. This means that if someone starts their shifts at 7 a.m., they should normally not be scheduled to work past 7 p.m., even if they were not actively performing work for all the hours in between. Additionally, employers may apply for a variance to authorize extended hours of work. Find out more about variances on our website. Sometimes employees must work a split shift, meaning there's more than 1 hour between the two segments of work. Split shifts must also be confined even though the employee might not be actively working for all hours between the shifts. Being on call or on standby does not in and of itself constitute work. An employer is not required to pay wages for the time an employee is waiting to be called to work, and this time is not included in the confinement period as the employee is not considered to be working. If the employee is on standby at the job site and is unable to leave or attend to other non-related matters, they must be paid wages. In this situation, if an employee is required to work, they are entitled to 3 hours at the minimum wage rule as discussed earlier. Remember that call-out hours may contribute also to weekly overtime hours. In general, breaks are unpaid. Employers may choose to pay for breaks if they want to. Employees that work shifts for 5 hours or less are not entitled to a break. If employees work more than 5 hours but less than 10, they are entitled to one 30-minute break. If employees work 10 hours or more, they are entitled to at least two 30-minute breaks. If both parties agree, they can split the 30-minute break into two 15-minute breaks. There are specific rules regarding when breaks are provided if the employer and employee cannot agree on a rest period schedule. When there is a disagreement on break times, the employer must provide at least 30 minutes within or immediately following the first 5 hours of the shift at a time chosen by the employer. If the shift is 10 hours or more, the employer must provide a second rest period of at least 30 minutes after the first 5 hours of the shift. Exceptions to this rule would be if one of the following occurs. An accident occurs or urgent work is required, other unforeseeable or unpreventable circumstances, different break arrangements have been made through a collective agreement, or it's not reasonable for the employee to take a rest period. If the employee is unable to take their rest period, then that rest period. In respects to days of rest, many employees receive 2 days off every week. The minimum requirement for rest is 1 day off in each work week, and a work week is considered 7 consecutive days. As you can see in the chart, the number of work weeks and required rest days can be combined. At the maximum, though, an employee who worked 24 straight days must receive 4 consecutive days off. Now let's take a look at overtime. When it comes to overtime, most employees are entitled to overtime pay at 1.5 times their wage rate for any hours worked over 8 hours in a day or 44 hours in a week, whichever is greater. This is known as the 844 rule. Banking time is permitted with a banked overtime agreement. Overtime is banked at a rate of 1 banked hour for each overtime hour. Banked overtime can sit for 6 months from when it is earned, but if it is not used, it is paid out at the 1.5 times the wage rate. The regulation outlines which industries and occupations have different rules. For example, there are alternative overtime rules for certain construction workers. Managers and certain professionals like engineers, accountants, and insurance agents are not entitled to overtime, but may be entitled to regular pay for all hours worked. Let's consider a scenario and apply the 8 and 44 rule for the overtime entitlement. First, calculate the daily overtime hours. This employee worked more than 8 hours per day. On Monday, 2 hours were overtime. Tuesday, 1 hour was overtime. And Thursday, 3 hours were overtime, for a total of 6 daily overtime hours. Second, calculate the employee's weekly overtime hours. 54 is the total of all the hours of work for that week, and then subtract 44 from it, which is our threshold. The total number of weekly overtime hours then is 10 hours. Finally, we need to compare both the daily and weekly hours and then pay the greater amount to the employee. This means for this scenario that the employee is entitled to receive 10 hours of overtime at 1.5 times their wage rate, or if they have a written overtime agreement, 10 hours will go into the overtime bank. Let's review some specific rules for the construction industry. Depending on your role and what project you're working on and where the site is located, different rules may apply to you. It's important to learn how construction employees are classified to ensure the correct rules are followed. There are 4 distinct types of construction employees covered under the legislation: construction, road building or heavy construction, as shown here, and 2 more that we will discuss on the next slide. A construction employee is someone employed at the site of and performs the activities on the left, specifically on buildings or roads, highways, sidewalks, among many other projects. Similarly, a road building or heavy construction operations employee, shown on the right of the slide, is someone employed in the construction, maintenance, repair, or demolition of the same projects, but they do not include such activities as remodeling, painting, or decorating. Some employees are not construction related, even if they might work for a construction company. They are any office employees employed on or off site, and any employees who perform ongoing maintenance at the site. A third category of construction employee includes those who work in a municipal district or Métis settlement. Specifically, there are employees who are performing road maintenance construction or snow removal from roads. The final category of construction worker are those who perform highway or railway construction outside of municipalities, which include any city, town, or village. Their work may also be in continuation from a boundary of the municipality. Because construction employees are involved in so many kinds of sites and projects, there may be confusion on how to classify employees under the appropriate industry. It's important to consider what duties are being performed, at which project site the work is conducted, and if there are any other information to support the exemption. As mentioned, on-site or off-site office employees or those who perform ongoing maintenance are not considered construction employees for the purposes of construction-related exceptions. Therefore, regular rules will apply for general holiday pay, vacation pay, and termination pay for on-site office employees or those engaged in maintenance. The type of project the employee is involved in is important in determining the exemption or exception status for the employee. Here are all the construction projects that are defined in the regulation. As you can see, some categories overlap throughout each of the different columns. This means that those employees may be subject to more than one exemption. And I'll give you a few moments to read this. Here are the other two categories of projects employees may be involved in. Remember, it's important to consider what duties are being performed, where, and what type of project is being completed. Now that we're a bit more familiar with the categories of construction employees, this slide gives a very brief overview of the exemptions for hours of work and overtime. In general, most employees are subject to the 12 hours confinement within a workday, which I spoke about earlier. A workday is a consecutive 24-hour period. For some employees, the hours of work can be up to a maximum of 16 hours within a workday. When the 16-hour rule applies, the employee may request their hours be confined within 12 hours per day, and the employer must comply with this request. While employees can work up to 16 hours per day, employers and employees must comply with safety work practices under occupational health and safety. This includes monitoring hours of work, if these extended hours can affect the health and safety of the workers or co-workers. Workers have the right and responsibility to refuse work if it appears unsafe. In addition to the hours of work exception, we need to review the overtime threshold for the employees. For these categories of employees, their threshold is the same as the regular one. Overtime are those hours over 8 hours in a day or 44 hours in a week, whichever is greater. And here are the other two categories of construction workers. As you can see, there are several different thresholds to consider for both hours of work confined and the overtime threshold. For both categories, depending on the project, employees may be subject to either the 12-hour or 16-hour confinement. For the road construction and maintenance folks in the middle column, their overtime threshold are those hours over 10 hours in a day or 191 hours in the month, whichever is greater. Please note that for the first and last month of employment, their threshold changes if fewer than 191 hours are worked in that month. Overtime in the first and last month may be calculated at hours over 10 hours per day or 44 hours in the week, again, whichever is greater. Highway and railway construction employees on the far right have an overtime threshold of hours of work of 10 hours per day or 44 hours in the week, whichever is greater. The more information we have, the more likely we can appropriately categorize the worker. It's possible that the worker may be subject to different thresholds on different projects in different months. Employers must be diligent to ensure the accurate entitlements are applied for their employees. Let's review some special rules for days of rest specific to road building and heavy construction employees. Road building employees must receive at least 4 days of rest within 4 consecutive weeks. The days do not have to be consecutive like they do for other employees. Employees can also request a full 24-hour period of rest in each work week if they didn't receive at least the minimum requirement for rest. Additionally, if an employee works more than 12 hours for a shift, they must receive at least 8 consecutive hours of rest after that shift. If an employee works 4 hours or less in a workday, the rest of the day may be considered a half day of rest. Let's look at general holiday and vacation entitlements. In respects to those who are construction employees, they are subject to varied vacation and general holiday pay rules. Construction employees are entitled to general holiday and vacation pay as soon as they start working. For each hour of work, they must be paid an additional 3.6% of wages for general holiday pay and 6% of wages for vacation pay. Office employees, whether on-site or off-site, and employees performing ongoing maintenance are not construction employees. Therefore, the regular vacation pay and general holiday pay and termination pay rules apply. For more information, construction employees are not entitled to days off for general holidays or vacations. They are also not entitled to 1.5 times their wage rates for working on a general holiday as per the regular rules for eligible employees. If employees are given vacation time off as a greater benefit, they must receive their vacation pay before their vacation starts. If vacation pay is paid on every paycheck, the vacation time off will be unpaid. If you want to check out our vacation pay requirements for employees who are not considered construction employees, please visit our website for more information. The general holiday pay and vacation pay must be paid before December 31st of each year or on the termination of the employment relationship. However, most employers give these entitlements to their construction workers each pay period. When these entitlements are paid, they are to be shown separately on the pay statement. This is important for record keeping as it concisely breaks down which payment is for which category of earning. Let's look again at how the exemptions may overlap. We know that there are varied overtime rules for those working in road construction or maintenance for municipal districts. Those are the workers in the far right column. Then we also have construction workers working on roadways in the middle column. These workers may work as long as 16 hours per day. Finally, we have the regular road construction workers in the far left column. These workers are subject to varied vacation pay, general holiday pay, and termination pay rules. Therefore, it is possible that all exemption categories apply to those employees. Again, it is extremely important to review all factors of the role and project to ensure accuracy in applying. Alternatively, let's say we have a road maintenance employee in the far right column. They are still subject to the varied overtime hours. And they are also subject to the maximum of 16 hours of work per day in the middle column, even though they're working on the road under the far left column. Again, the construction rules do not apply to employees doing ongoing maintenance. Therefore, varied overtime rules and hours of work rules will apply. But road maintenance employees are subject to regular vacation, general holiday, and termination pay requirements. Let's move on to termination. In respects to termination notice or pay in lieu of notice, only office employees on or off site and maintenance employees are entitled under our regular rules. Construction employees are not entitled to termination notice or pay in lieu of notice, which we will check on the next slide. To reiterate, construction employees are not entitled to termination pay or notice by their employer, and are not required to notify the employer in advance if they plan to quit. This could mean that a construction employee who has worked for the same employer for 15 years would not be entitled to any additional pay when they are terminated. The employee may wish to review any civil claim if they wish. A reminder that this is under the minimum standards in the legislation, and employers may wish to offer greater benefits if they wish to do so. Job protective leaves entitle employees to time off without pay to attend to specific types of personal or family matters. Job protective leaves are unpaid, though the employer always has the option to pay an employee during the leave. For many leaves, employees may be required to have been employed with their employer for at least 90 days and are often required to provide their employer with some type of notice or documentation prior to starting the leave and/or returning to work. Here are the short-term leaves available. In general, employees are not required to provide any medical notes or other documentation to utilize these short-term leaves. However, the employee must provide as much notice as reasonable given the circumstances to take the leave. Now let's review our regular leaves that are of a longer term. I'll give you a few moments to read about them. A medical certificate issued by a physician or nurse practitioner is required for long-term illness and injury leave, critical illness leave, and compassionate care leave. In some situations, a medical certificate may be required for maternity or parental leave. Please note most short-term and long. Let's wrap up today's session. We've covered a lot of content, and we hope that we've been able to give you valuable information and answers to your questions. We would like to remind you that there will be a recording of this session on our website for you to review. There are many workplace-related questions and concerns that employment standards does not cover. Each day our teams receive numerous requests which are referred out to different agencies and governing bodies. Some of the most common referrals we give are for records of employment, or ROEs, and employment insurance questions, which are all directed to Service Canada. At times, there are tax-related questions, which we direct to the Canada Revenue Agency. Questions regarding workplace injuries, safety concerns, discrimination at the workplace, or unethical conduct by an employer are referred to the Workers' Compensation Board, Occupational Health and Safety, or the Human Rights Commission. Albertans may also be advised to consider reviewing their concern with a lawyer. Overall, the teams at Employment Standards provides general information regarding the minimum standards in the legislation. The information is not intended to be legal advice. Additionally, although parts of the Employment Standards Code cover employees under a collective agreement, Employment Standards cannot investigate complaints from unionized employees. These employees will be referred to their respective union or the Labor Relations Board if they feel they have not been represented properly by their union. We have a number of resources out there for you to find more information. Please remember to visit our website. The full link is shown here for your reference. There you'll discover e-learning tools, find recorded webinars, and learn about upcoming dates of future live webinars. And please note the King's printer is responsible for providing copies of the Employment Standards Code and regulation. Here are our website links specific to the construction categories. I'll give you a few moments to review them. Remember that if you need to make a complaint, you can go to our website with the web address on the screen. If you want to contact us or ask a question, please use our contact page listed on the slide. Additionally, you can utilize our contact center toll-free at 1-877-427-3731. And if you want to share an anonymous tip with Employment Standards, the link is also provided on the slide. This concludes our presentation on rules for the construction industry. Thank you for watching, and we hope that you have a pleasant day.